125 years. That is how long the concrete inside Hoover Dam would have taken to cool on its own. Could a dam survive that long while its own chemistry tore it apart from the inside? 125 years of heat trapped inside 3 million cubic yards of concrete, cooking the core past 140 degrees Fahrenheit, cracking the structure from the inside out, turning the most important dam ever built in North America into a slow-motion catastrophe pressed against by 26.2 million acre-feet of the Colorado River. That is not speculation. That is what the Bureau of Reclamation's engineers calculated, precisely, before a single bucket of concrete went into the canyon. If the dam had failed, and without the machine, it would have. The water behind it would have hit everything downstream with a force that nothing in its path could survive. They solved the problem, but it nearly solved them first. Look at what they built to fight it. A refrigeration plant so large it was, at the time of construction, the largest in human history, sitting on the edge of a Nevada desert canyon, running around the clock against 110-degree desert heat, chilling water down to 35 degrees and pumping it through a pipe network buried inside the living dam. 582 miles of thin steel pipe sealed inside the concrete forever, pulling heat out degree by degree while the dam rose above the Colorado River Canyon 1 5-foot lift at a time, 1,000 tons of ice, every day, for nearly 2 years. And underneath those pipes and that refrigeration plant and those 5 cableways swinging 20-ton concrete, buckets across the open canyon every 78 seconds, underneath all of it, men were dying, 1 every 6 weeks on average, falling from canyon walls, crushed by equipment, and in the diversion tunnels, breathing invisible gas in 140-degree darkness, dying of something their employer had decided to call pneumonia. This is the story of the machine that saved Hoover Dam, the biggest refrigerator in human history, built in the heat of a desert canyon, fighting the chemistry of concrete that the Romans understood 2,000 years ago, but never dared at this scale. The question that runs through everything: how do you cool 3 million cubic yards of concrete in a desert, faster than physics allows, without killing the men doing it? The Romans never faced it. No one had. Hoover Dam was the first. We're going to find out exactly how it worked, and exactly what it cost. Because those two things, the machine and the price, are the same story. What the Romans knew and what Black Canyon refused to forgive. The Romans poured the Pantheon's dome in 125 A.D., 142 feet across, unreinforced concrete. Still holding after 20 centuries of earthquakes and floods, they poured harbor walls at Caesarea directly into the Mediterranean, and those walls got stronger over time as seawater chemically bonded with the volcanic ash in the mix. Roman concrete was extraordinary, a material that improved with age rather than degrading, a formula that modern scientists are still working to fully replicate. But Roman engineers never built anything dense enough to kill itself with its own chemistry, which raises a question they never had to answer. What do you do when the concrete is the enemy? Hydration is what makes concrete work. Mix Portland cement with water, and the calcium silicate compounds begin crystallizing, bonding, tightening, locking aggregate into place. And as they do, they release heat. In a sidewalk or a building foundation, that heat bleeds out through the surface in hours. The chemistry finishes. The concrete hardens. No problem. Scale that same chemistry up to the dimensions of Hoover Dam, and you've got a completely different beast. The dam would stand 726 feet tall. Its base would be 660 feet thick. You could stand 11 school buses end to end in that thickness and still have room. When you pour concrete at that scale, the surface bleeds heat into the desert air. But the core, hundreds of feet from any exterior face, is sealed inside an insulating mass with nowhere to go. The heat of hydration builds. It climbs past 100 degrees, past 120, The engineers calculated it would reach 140 degrees Fahrenheit inside those blocks. Then it has to cool, and that's where the dam would have died. The outside contracts first, faster than the interior. They pull against each other with enormous force. Not the sudden violence of a fracture, but the slow, relentless differential measured in millimeters and multiplied across the entire mass of the structure. Microscopic cracks form along the thermal stress lines, widen, propagate. What looks like solid concrete from the outside is, in the core, a network of permanent weaknesses, invisible, deep inside where no inspection can reach and no repair is possible. Now put that cracked concrete at the base of a 726-foot dam and start filling the reservoir behind it. The Colorado River presses against the upstream face, the water weight building as the lake rises, 45,000 pounds per square foot at the base when the reservoir is full. That pressure finds the cracks. It works into them, slowly, with the patience water has always had. A thermally fractured dam doesn't fail the day the cracks form. It fails the day the river finds the path through them, and the Colorado River had 12 million years of practice finding paths through solid rock. The engineers calculated the timeline, 125 years to cool naturally. By the time the concrete reached equilibrium, the thermal damage would already be done. The dam would be standing, and it would be dying, slowly, invisibly from the inside. So how do you stop it? How do you pull heat out of a mountain of concrete in the Nevada desert, fast enough to matter, in quantities that had never been attempted? That was the problem waiting for the Bureau of Reclamation in 1928, when Congress authorized the project. The Colorado River had been running wild through the American Southwest for 12 million years, carving the Grand Canyon out of solid rock, a mile deep and 10 miles wide, using nothing but time and suspended sediment and the patience of geology. It flooded without warning when the Rockies got heavy rain. It drowned farmland and settlements when the snowpack released in spring. It dropped to a trickle by late summer. It had ignored every attempt humans had made to predict or contain it. 7 states depended on its water. None of them could control it. Los Angeles was booming and demanding more water than the land around it could supply. Phoenix was expanding into the desert. Las Vegas was a railroad town trying to become a city, all of them thirsty, all of them dependent on a river that had answered to no one for 12 million years and showed no sign of changing that arrangement voluntarily. The dam would rise in Black Canyon on the Nevada-Arizona border in solid volcanic rock capable of bearing the load. It would impound Lake Mead 26, 2 million acre-feet of water, the largest reservoir in the United States. Its generators would power the cities of the Southwest for decades. The Colorado River, which had carved the Grand Canyon, was about to be stopped by concrete, chilled water, and a man in a Stetson who hadn't slept through a full night in 20 years. But was the solution Crow and the Bureau had designed actually buildable? In the middle of a desert, in 130-degree heat, with men dying from the conditions before the first yard of concrete went into the dam. But first, someone had to solve the concrete, and the concrete was going to try to solve them first. In March 1931, the federal government awarded the contract to 6 Companies, Inc., a consortium of construction firms that had pooled resources to win what was, at the time, the largest government construction contract in American history. The winning bid, $48.9 million. The daily penalty for falling behind the contractual schedule, $3,000 per day. And the man they put in charge of making it happen, Frank Crow. Crow had spent 20 years building dams across the American West. He wore a Stetson on the job. He refused desks. He showed up at 2 in the morning to walk the site and see the work with his own eyes. Not to check reports, but to see it, the same way a man checks a rope before he trusts his weight to it. Workers followed him from job to job across 2 decades, not because he was an easy boss. He was not. But because with Crow the impossible got built on time, he had a motto: never my belly to a desk. He had pioneered the use of overhead cableway systems for delivering concrete on dam projects, refining the technique on progressively larger builds across Idaho, Wyoming, and California. For Hoover Dam, he brought that system to a scale nobody had attempted before, and he drove it with a man who had $3 a day reasons to push the pace and 50 years of professional reputation riding on whether it came in ahead of schedule. The solution to the concrete problem was conceptually clean. Don't pour the dam as one continuous mass. Divide it into 215 separate columns, blocks arranged in an interlocking grid, each one poured in 5-foot vertical lifts, with cooling pipes embedded inside every lift. Cool each block to a stable temperature before the next lift goes on top. When the cooling is done and the concrete has stopped contracting, fill the joints between columns with grout and lock the whole structure into one monolithic wall. Simple in concept, brutally complex in execution, in a canyon that was already killing people just from standing in it, driven by a schedule with no room for the physics to work at its own pace. But could the machine they needed to pull this off actually be built and kept running? In a Nevada desert canyon where the air temperature was already lethal, the largest refrigerator in the world, running against 130-degree heat, 1 inch. That is the diameter of the steel cooling pipe that engineers buried throughout Hoover Dam. Thin-walled, 14-gauge tubing, roughly the width of a thick thumb, laid in coils ranging from 220 to 1,340 feet long, placed 5 feet apart vertically and about 5.5 feet apart horizontally, inside every single one of the dam's 215 concrete columns. Total pipe, 582 miles, Los Angeles to San Francisco and back again, sealed inside concrete forever. But how do you get chilled water through 582 miles of buried pipe in enough volume to actually change the temperature of 3 million cubic yards of concrete? And how do you do it against a desert sun that's already pushing 110 degrees outside the dam while you're trying to cool it to 54 degrees inside? Before any of that pipe saw a drop of chilled water, the concrete had to get there. 2 batch plants sat on the Nevada side of the canyon, one on the canyon floor, one on the rim. The upper plant, fully automated, could produce 24 cubic yards of concrete in 3.5 minutes. It ran continuously around the clock, measured and mixed and loaded without stopping. But here's the problem with the concrete that nobody talks about. The mix had to be as dry as possible. A stiff low-water ratio, because wetter concrete is weaker concrete, and weak concrete under 45 he-pounds per square foot from the Colorado River is a failure waiting for an occasion. A stiff mix, but a stiff mix sets fast. From the moment water hit the cement in that batch plant, the clock was running. The window to get the concrete from the drum into the form, placed, vibrated, and smooth was measured in minutes. Miss the window and you had a bucket of rubble, a void in the dam structure, a weakness the river would eventually find and exploit. So the cableway had to be fast. Every 78 seconds, a fresh bucket. No delays, no jams, no mechanical failures during production hours. What happened when the failures came anyway, and they always came? The batch plant, the rail cars, the cableway towers, the bucket release mechanisms, all of it had to function as one integrated machine, continuously, in desert heat that made equipment fail as a matter of routine. And the men had to be faster than the concrete. When a bucket arrived at the pour site, a worker pulled the release. 8 cubic yards dropped. 7 puddlers went to work immediately, stomping, paddling, running pneumatic vibrators through the fresh mix to force out air pockets and seat the concrete against the pipe coils already embedded in the form. They had to finish before the concrete stiffened, and overhead the next bucket was already coming. Now for the cooling. Once the concrete was placed and the form was sealed, the first stage of cooling began immediately. Colorado River water, pumped cold through the embedded pipe coils. The river water was cooler than the desert air and pulled the initial spike of hydration heat away before it could build to dangerous levels. But the river temperature in summer ran in the 70s, too warm to pull the core of a thick concrete block down to the 54-degree target within any reasonable time frame. That's where the refrigeration plant came in. It went up on the Hoover Dam, the temporary river barrier, capable of producing 1,000 tons of ice in a single 24-hour period. The chilled water it produced, pumped out at 34 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, entered the pipe network and circulated continuously through the embedded coils, absorbing heat from the curing concrete and returning warmed to the plant to be chilled and recirculated. The loop ran without stopping, day shift, swing shift graveyard, for nearly 2 years, the target 54 degrees Fahrenheit per block. Not an approximation, exactly 54 degrees, the calculated mean annual ambient temperature for Black Canyon, the point at which the concrete had released all its hydration heat and stopped contracting. Hit 54 degrees, and the chemistry was finished. You could grout the joints between columns, you could add the next lift, you could trust it. Fall short of 54. Rush the schedule, push the pace, let a block sit warmer than it should, and you grouted joints that were still moving. The grout cracked, the block shifted, the integrity of the column was compromised. And a compromised column deep inside the structure was not something you could go back and fix. Total heat the cooling system had to extract before it was done, 1.59 billion BTUs, pulled out through 582 miles of buried pipe by a refrigeration plant running in 110-degree desert air. That is the full chemical energy released by 3.25 million cubic yards of curing concrete, and every single BTU of it had to be removed before the engineers could trust the structure to hold the river. But could Crow's pace, 3 shifts, 7 days, a $3,000 a day penalty running like a meter, stay within the margins the cooling system needed? That question was being answered in real time. And the answers weren't always reassuring. There was also this: all the engineering precision of the cooling system, all the miles of pipe and the chilled water and the refrigeration plant, none of it mattered if the machine delivering the concrete killed the men running it before the dam was finished. The cableway was elegant in design and lethal in proximity. 5 systems simultaneously operating in the same airspace above the dam. A concrete bucket weighing 20 tons when loaded, crossing the canyon every 78 seconds all day long. And below those buckets, every time a bucket moved, men working the forms, connecting the cooling pipe manifolds, waiting for the pour. The engineers had designed the cableway system for precision. The math on arc and load and cable tension was correct. What the math couldn't design around was the human factor, the worker who stepped into the drop zone a half-second early, the bucket that caught a canyon wind gust, the release mechanism that had cycled 10,000 times and was due to cycle once more. These things didn't happen often. In a system running every 78 seconds for nearly 2 years, they didn't need to happen often. At least 13 workers were killed by cableway operations alone. The pipe crews who worked the cooling system inside the rising dam, crawling through the confined passages between forms and canyon walls, managing pressurized connections and grout injection lines, had their own set of hazards that the engineering drawings didn't fully account for. There was no phase of this project that wasn't dangerous. There was no job description that didn't carry a risk of not going home. How long could that hold? And what happened when the pace Crow was running pushed the cooling system and the men passed their limits? What the men in the canyon survived and what they didn't. The summer of 1931 hit before Boulder City existed. Workers streamed in from across the country. Depression-era America. 20% of the workforce unemployed. Any job a lifeline. They built a shanty town on the canyon floor. They called it Ragtown. At its peak, 5 people, tents, cardboard, salvaged tin, black volcanic walls that absorbed solar heat all day and released it through the night, so the canyon never truly cooled, even at 3 in the morning. In July 1931, the average daily high in the canyon, 116 degrees. On the floor, reflected heat from the walls pushed it past 130. In the first June-July period alone, more than 25 men, women, and children in Ragtown died from heat conditions. The dam hadn't started yet. They were still boring the diversion tunnels. The tunnels were where the institutional killing began. And what happened there is one of the most deliberate industrial cover-ups in American construction history. 4 diversion tunnels had to be blasted and drilled through the canyon walls before any concrete could go into the dam. Each 156 feet in diameter, the size of a 4-lane highway bored through solid volcanic rock. Workers drove gasoline-powered vehicles and equipment inside. Carbon monoxide from the exhaust accumulated in the confined space, invisible and odorless. Tunnel temperatures in summer reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Men collapsed at their stations, some unconscious before they understood what was happening. They were carried out, revived, and sent back in. Nevada had outlawed gasoline-powered vehicles in enclosed tunnels in 1929, specifically because the mining industry already knew what carbon monoxide did in a confined space. The state inspector of mines toured the Hoover Dam tunnels and formally recommended the ban be enforced. 6 companies ignored it. The Secretary of the Interior, a medical doctor who understood carbon monoxide pathophysiology, provided federal legal support to protect 6 companies' operation. A federal court eventually ruled Nevada's mining code didn't apply to a federal reclamation project. The workers had no protection and no recourse. Men began dying. Cause of death on the official records: pneumonia. It was not pneumonia. Carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin and starves the tissues of oxygen. The symptoms, headache, confusion, collapse, could be made to look like illness when someone needed them to look like illness. Families of the dead filed lawsuits. They lost. In one case that went to trial, a worker named Ed Krause testified that carbon monoxide exposure had left him permanently impotent. 6 companies' legal team arranged for a prostitute to test his claim. They used the result to discredit him in court and won. Men classified as dying of pneumonia during tunnel construction. Between 40 and 46, every single death was contested by the family. Not one family prevailed. 6 companies was fined $3,000 per day for construction delays. It was never fined a single dollar for a worker's death. And still the men came, because it was 1931. 20% of the national workforce was unemployed. In Black Canyon, you made 63 cents an hour. You had food, shelter, a hospital in Boulder City. 3 miles away you stayed. Above the canyon floor, the high scalers faced a different daily reckoning. These were the men who cleared the canyon walls before the concrete work could begin. 800 feet. Down on thin ropes carrying 44-pound jackhammers, drilling blast holes in sheer volcanic rock, packing dynamite, swinging themselves clear before detonation. Then back in with crowbars to lever broken material loose, still on the rope, still in the air, in 120-degree heat that made the rock hot enough to burn bare hands. How long could a man last swinging a 44-pound jackhammer on a rope in that heat? The answer was shorter than anyone on the payroll wanted to count. Hard hats didn't exist for construction workers. High scalers dipped cloth caps in hot coal tar until they stiffened into a rigid shell. Management saw the improvised helmets surviving rockfall impacts and ordered thousands more for other workers. The construction hard hat, now mandatory on every job site in the developed world, was invented by men trying not to die in Black Canyon. Falling rocks were the leading cause of death at the site. Rocks dislodged by blast work, by weathering, by the constant vibration of machinery running without pause. A man on a rope 50 feet below a blast zone had exactly as much warning as the silence, immediately before a rock hit him. Now put the cableway into this picture. 20-ton concrete buckets crossing the canyon every 78 seconds, while high scalers worked the walls and pipe crews worked inside the forms, and puddlers worked the fresh concrete below. A cable stress fracture, a release latch that seated wrong, a load shift in wet concrete that changed the bucket's pendulum arc by 5 feet. Any one of those sent 20 tons through whatever was below it, without a fraction of a second's warning. At least 13 workers were killed by cableway operations alone, each one in the narrow gap between the system working as designed and the system failing in the presence of a human being. The pipe crews working inside the dam had their own constant hazards: confined passages, pressurized fittings, grout injections at high pressure in spaces where a blowout could fill a passage with scalding cement slurry before anyone in it could react. The small accidents were accumulating, the close calls were getting less close, and in the temperature records, the Bureau engineers kept block by block through the dam. A pattern was forming that nobody in 6 companies' management wanted to discuss directly. The schedule Crow was running was pressing the cooling system to its margins. Some blocks were being loaded before they'd quite reached 54 degrees. Not by much, but by enough to worry the men who understood what happened when you grouted a joint that was still contracting. Every 6 weeks on average a man died. Was that the worst of it? Not even close, because the dying that happened in public, the falls, the rock slides, the struck men, was only part of the story. And the part that happened in private was worse. Crow never stopped. 3 shifts, 7 days. The concrete went in, the pipes ran cold, the cableways swung their 20-ton loads, and in the tunnels, in the dark, men were dying of something their employer had decided to call pneumonia. 3 men, 1 date, 14 years, the true cost of the canyon. The first man to die in connection with Hoover Dam was J.G. Tierney. Not a construction worker, the dam hadn't been authorized yet, and the last man to die. You won't see it coming. It was December 20, 1921, and Tierney was a Bureau of Reclamation surveyor on the Colorado River doing preliminary geological surveys for the dam site. A flash flood caught his crew. Tierney went into the river and was never recovered. His body was not found. Exactly 14 years later, December 20, 1935, the last man died at Hoover Dam. His name was Patrick William Tierney, J.G., Tierney's only son. He fell several hundred feet from one of the Arizona intake towers and drowned, father and son, the same date, 14 years apart. The first and the last, same blood, same river, same project. Their names are in raised metal on a plaque at the dam. Marie Tierney, wife and mother, lost her husband and her only son to the same project on the same calendar date, 14 years apart. She is not on the plaque. Official industrial death toll, 96. Add the pneumonia deaths the families argued were carbon monoxide, over 112. Add all indirect work-related deaths traced by historians, as many as 187. But the largest danger at Hoover Dam was never a single man in a single moment. It was what happened if the cooling system failed at scale, not just to one man, but to everything downstream. Lake Mead at full pool, 26, 2 million acre-feet. Pressure at the dam's base, 45,000 pounds per square foot. If the thermal cracking had propagated through the dam's core, if the cooling had been pushed too fast, if blocks had been grouted while they were still above 54 degrees and still contracting, if the fractures had grown before the grout locked them in place, the dam would have failed under that load. Not necessarily on day one, maybe not for years, but concrete that is cracked along its thermal stress lines under the sustained pressure of the largest reservoir in the United States finds its failure point eventually. and when it found it, the wall of water hitting the canyon below would have been unsurvivable at any distance that wasn't measured in miles. The downstream death toll from a failed Hoover Dam in the 1930s is not precisely calculable. It would not have been in the dozens. It would not have been in the hundreds. The cooling machine was never a construction detail. It was the only thing standing between the dam and a failure that would have been one of the worst disasters in American history. So what nearly broke it? What came closest to pushing the system past its margins? In August 1931, workers in the diversion tunnels, breathing carbon monoxide in 140-degree heat, watching colleagues collapse and not get back up, walked off the job, 6 days on strike. They demanded better ventilation, enforcement of the gas vehicle ban, basic safety conditions. Crow fired the strikers and filled their positions from the line of unemployed men waiting outside the gate. The strike ended in 6 days. Not one safety condition changed. Inside the dam structure itself, the Bureau's engineers and 6 companies were in a continuous argument about pace that had life-or-death implications, not just for individual workers but for the integrity of the structure. Bureau specifications capped concrete placement at 5 feet per block in any 72-hour window. That limit existed because exceeding it, pouring concrete onto concrete that hadn't yet reached a stable thermal state, created temperature differentials large enough to fracture the block from within. A crack in an interior block, deep inside the structure, invisible from the outside, was not something anyone could fix. It would be there forever under pressure, waiting. 6 companies pushed toward that 5-foot limit every day. The $3,000 a day penalty for delay was always running. The Bureau pushed back. Every concrete pour in the peak of construction was a negotiation between a contract and physics. And physics did not have a stake in the bonus. Frank Crow would collect if he came in ahead of schedule. The concrete held, the system held, not because the conditions were right. They weren't, but because enough of the right decisions were made under impossible pressure, and the machine inside the dam was strong enough to compensate for the ones that weren't. Consider what happened after the concrete cooled in each block. The cooling pipes had done their job, but they couldn't just be left empty inside a load-bearing structure. An empty pipe is a void, a weakness, a path for water infiltration under pressure. So workers pumped grout, a pressurized cement slurry, through every inch of the 582-mile pipe network, filling them solid. Simultaneously, the contraction gaps that had opened between adjacent columns as the concrete cooled, hairline cracks, measured in fractions of an inch, were also filled with grout injected under pressure. This operation transformed the structure from 215 separate blocks into one solid wall. Without it, the dam was columns. With it, it was a single thing. But grout under pressure in a confined pipe network is not gentle. A failed seal during injection, a blowout sent cement slurry at high pressure through whatever passage it found. Workers operating the injection equipment in the dam's interior tunnels and passages were working with a material that could set around them if the system failed. The grout operations ran through 1934 and into 1935, long after the last concrete pour. There was no phase of this project that was finished being dangerous before the dam was complete. How close did it actually come to failing? Not a worker, but the structure itself. The engineer's temperature records are the most honest answer. Some blocks show temperature readings that, in the weeks before grouting, were running warmer than 54 degrees. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but measurably above the target, because the schedule was moving faster than the cooling system could fully compensate. The grout was injected, the joints sealed, the blocks stabilized. But the margin between this worked and this cracked was measured in degrees and days, not in the comfortable engineering tolerances of peacetime construction, but only barely and not without cost. What the machine left inside the dam and what the dam left behind. On May 29, 1935, the last concrete was placed in Hoover Dam. Cooling of all sections completed the previous March. Nearly 2 years of refrigeration plant running, 582 miles of pipe flushing chilled water through the mountain, 1.59 billion BTUs extracted from the concrete mass. Then the grout, injected under pressure into the contraction joints between columns, sealing the hairline gaps that the cooling contraction had opened, locking 215 individual blocks into one monolithic structure. Then the cooling pipes themselves were grouted solid. Every inch of the 582-mile network was filled and sealed. The pipes that had saved the dam became part of the dam. They will never be removed. They are Hoover Dam. On September 30, 1935, President Roosevelt dedicated the structure to the nation before 20,000 people. Frank Crowe finished nearly 2 years ahead of the contractual deadline and collected a $350,000 bonus. 6 companies walked away from the most profitable large government contract in American history. The Colorado River backed up behind the dam and began filling Lake Mead. When the reservoir reached full pool, 2 million acre-feet, pressed against a curved concrete face at 45,000 pounds per square foot, exactly the load the engineers had calculated for a structure the cooling system had made whole, the wall held. Hoover Dam still stands today, more than 90 years after the first bucket of concrete dropped on June 6, 1933. The Bureau of Reclamation has confirmed the concrete is in remarkable condition, in large part because the thermal stresses that would have destroyed it never developed. The cooling worked, the grout sealed the joints, the structure held the river. Some of those 582 miles of pipe are still inside the dam right now, grouted solid, part of the structure permanently. You cannot remove them without removing the dam. During specialized tours of the dam's interior, you can sometimes see the cut ends of old cooling pipes at the concrete face, a thin circular trace where grout meets block. They look like nothing. They are the remains of the largest refrigeration system ever built to that date, and they are the dam. What replaced the technique? Modern mass concrete uses pre-cooled aggregate, chilled mixwater, and liquid nitrogen at the batch plant. But for truly massive pours, major dams, nuclear containment structures, pipe cooling embedded in fresh concrete is still used. The Three Gorges Dam in China used a direct descendant of the Hoover system. The principle hasn't been superseded in 90 years. What replaced the men? Regulations they helped write by dying without protection. The carbon monoxide deaths, classified as pneumonia, denied in court, eventually forced the regulatory changes that brought federal safety standards to construction sites nationwide. They lost their cases, but they changed the law. J.G. Tierney is gone. Patrick Tierney is gone. The 96 officially classified dead are recorded by the Bureau of Reclamation, year by year, cause by cause. The 40 to 46 classified as pneumonia are not on that list. The 5,000 who survived Ragtown and the Canyon and the Cable Runs carry no individual record. Frank Crowe died in 1946 at 63 on his cattle ranch in California. He never built another dam. Was it worth it? The men who fell from the walls didn't get to answer. The men who choked in the tunnels didn't get to answer. What remains is the structure, still holding 90 years on, and the question of what that answer actually means. The dam generates 5 billion kilowatt-hours per year. Lake Mead supplies water to 25 million people across 7 states and Mexico. Las Vegas, Phoenix, Los Angeles, in the form they exist today, none of it is possible without Hoover Dam. None of Hoover Dam is possible without the machine that fought the concrete from the inside while the canyon tried to kill the men building it. Standing on the dam crest, looking down 726 feet to the canyon floor, you see concrete. You see the curve of an arch-gravity wall holding the largest reservoir in the United States. What you don't see is the 582 miles of steel pipe inside that wall, grouted solid, sealed in place, the ghost of ice water that ran through this mountain for 2 years to hold the chemistry together. You don't see the refrigeration plant. You don't see the men crawling through the pipe manifolds at midnight checking temperatures. You don't see the ones who fell from the walls or the ones who breathed invisible gas in the tunnels until they stopped. You don't see the father and son who both died on the same date, 14 years apart, in service of the same river. The Romans built concrete that lasted 2,000 years. The engineers at Hoover Dam built concrete that had to work under conditions the Romans never imagined. 3 million cubic yards of it, cooling from the inside, in a desert canyon where the heat alone could kill you, where 582 miles of buried pipe ran cold against the chemistry trying to tear the structure apart. They solved the problem. The machine they built is still locked inside the dam. The dam is still holding the river. Progress has a price. At Black Canyon, they paid it in degrees and in blood. 96 names on the official plaque, 46 more the records call pneumonia, and however many others the accounting never got around to counting. The concrete is standing. That's what they paid for. They don't build them like that anymore. Not the machines, not the dams, and not the men who went into that canyon in 1931, in the middle of the Depression, knowing what the odds were, and went in anyway. The canyon took what it demanded. The river got what it was due.